Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Star Wars was designed to be a mirror in which audiences could self-reflect on. The Galactic Empire was designed by George Lucas to represent the fascists of World War II. Everything from the Galactic Empire's behavior to the crisp uniforms was supposed to emulate that political system and ideology. The fall of the Galactic Republic during the prequels was a reminder of how fragile a democracy could be and how easily someone from inside the system, using populism and fear of external threats, could destroy it all and plunge the galaxy into conflict. This was seen by some as a commentary about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. One of my favorite things about Star Wars is finding connections in its lore to real-life history in our own world. It makes things seem a little more realistic in that way. Today we'll be looking at a character created by George Lucas and then fully fleshed out by other creators like Dave Filoni, the partisan leader known as Saw Gerera. Saw Gerera was originally conceived by George Lucas for the unreleased and later on canceled Star Wars TV show known as Underworld. Lucas had this crazy idea of decreasing the cost of filmmaking to the point where a TV show could look as good as a feature film and cost much less. All he really needed was the price-cutting technology that The Mandalorian currently is using to build its worlds. Underworld was supposed to be set in between Episode 3 and Episode 4, and it was announced in 2005 and then put on hold in 2010 because of budgetary constraints. This would have been my favorite show ever, probably, because it was supposed to take place in the magical and dark underworld of Coruscant, a place where someone like Saw Gerera could be king. Originally, during the development, Saw Gerrera's codename was actually Castro, as in Fidel Castro, the controversial Cuban revolutionary. And Saw Gerrera's name was actually a play on the Argentinian revolutionary Che Guevara's name. He was one of Castro's bloodiest associates. Saw Gerera and Che Guevara were both heavily influenced by the terrible things they saw as young adults. Saw Gerera's military career would start out as a fighter in the Honduran resistance, which at the time was opposed to the separatist-backed ruler of the planet. Che Guevara would set out from Argentina on a motorcycle and saw the devastation and poverty running rampant through South America. He would quickly become radicalized and would join the Cuban Revolution a decade later. After Saw Gerera and the Honduranians kicked out the separatist threat from their planet, the Republic would turn into the Empire after Order 66 and reoccupy Honduran. Saw Gerera was forced once again to pick up a blaster and fight back. After the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara would continue to fight for the emancipation of the people through socialism and revolution. As part of the Cuban delegation to the UN in 1964, Che Guevara confronted the organization about their inability to stop apartheid occurring in South Africa and denounced the United States' own mistreatment towards its black population. On the other hand, he would also help lead the brutal crackdowns that occurred during the Cuban Revolution, and also he would be involved in revolutionary movements in the Congo and in Bolivia as a guerrilla fighter. Somewhere along the line, both Saw Gerera and Che Guevara lost the message. Or perhaps they never really got the message in the first place. Saw Gerera started out as an Honduranian resistance fighter, and shortly after Order 66, we still see him taking care of refugees, the elderly, and sick. But by the time Rogue One comes out, Saw Gerera was more machine than man, and his outfit, the Partisans, looked more like a hardened band of criminals rather than freedom fighters. Troubling news began to circulate about the war crimes and massacres being carried out by Saw's partisans. ISB agent Callis had survived one of these brutal massacres, and he himself had been radicalized against a rebellion for that reason. A lot of people seem to romanticize Che Guevara as this individual who fought for the poor and the forgotten. This is why some people like wearing Che Guevara's face on their shirts. But there was a much darker side to Che Guevara, which I think was more indicative of who he was as a person. When he was placed in charge of the La Habana prison in Cuba by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara assumed the role of judge, jury, and executioner. It's estimated that he ordered the deaths of over 500 individuals who were loosely tied to the former Batista regime he helped overthrow. It was said that Che Guevara enjoyed personally shooting many of these prisoners whenever he had time. Che Guevara murdered women, the elderly, even children, anyone who was an enemy to the proletariat. The reality is individuals like Che Guevara and Saw Gerera ultimately resorted to violence and cruelty because they were most likely consumed by the madness of their conflict. Che Guevara saw so much suffering being imposed on the peasant classes in South America that he in turn became a monster himself in order to fight against these injustices. It is also very possible that he was just a psychopath from the very beginning. Saw Gerera was eventually driven mad by the horrific things he saw as well, from the death of his sister at the hands of the Separatist Alliance to the horrible oppression of the Empire. Both these revolutionaries had ceased seeing their enemies as sentient beings. All they saw were enemies that needed to be massacred and killed. It's an oversimplification that happens a lot when emotions and experience override the more rational sides of our mind. It takes a great deal of mental toughness, fortitude, and also emotional intelligence to continue to humanize the enemies you're fighting against. Che Guevara and Saw Gerera were unfortunately both pretty simple-minded individuals who mainly relied on charisma rather than intelligence when they led. Saw Gerera never seemed to understand that no matter how many stormtroopers he killed, there was no way he could win this war against the Empire through military might alone. His entire existence is futile because of this. Che Guevara is oftentimes seen as an intellectual, but simply being able to read and engage in philosophical discussions does not make one an intellectual. One needs to also engage in critical thinking and expand upon those ideas. Che Guevara was famous for being a hot-headed individual who was unwilling to compromise. It's probably what ultimately led to his death in Bolivia fighting against the military there. Che Guevara also had a very irrational hatred towards homosexuals, and he would enact policies that would send them to labor camps. He also supported the elimination of all newspapers, coming to the conclusion that revolutions cannot be made with a free press. Ultimately, it doesn't take a lot of thinking or intelligence to be a guerrilla fighter, especially when you're just carrying out terrorist attacks and targeting soft targets. Saw Gerera would eventually be consumed by his violence, hatred, and anger, and would be chased around by death until his last days on Jeddah. Violence begets violence. The same shadow would follow Che Guevara till the day he was executed by the Bolivian army. Now, Saw Gerera and his partisans at the very end had already been kicked out by the Alliance to Restore the Republic, led by former Galactic Senate Representative Mon Mothma. The Alliance to Restore the Republic built a rebellion strategy that focused more on the hearts and minds of the people rather than just military targets. Mon Mothma and Saw Gerera would clash time and time again about how resources should be used. What Saw Gerera seemed to lack that Che Guevara had was some kind of unifying ideology. In Che Guevara's case, it was Cuban communism. And unlike Che, who died relatively young, Saw Gerera grew old as a partisan, something that rarely happens to violent men such as him. In his last years, Saw Gerera seemed tired and willingly embraced the death that was coming for him. And that's because I believe Saw Gerera was never really built to be a revolutionary figure. It was always his sister who had the ideas and passion for revolution. She had the intellect and charm to build a movement around her that meant more than just killing things. And when she died, Saw Gerera tried his best to carry on for her, but at the end of the day, Saw Gerera is a much more common type of individual. He's a soldier. A soldier who has gotten used to and comfortable with fighting and warfare and has no real strategy to ever lead that life. To me, Saw Gerera actually closely represents a mujahideen fighter from Afghanistan. Both of these types of fighters have very similar histories. Saw and his partners were benefactors of a potent foreign internal defense program orchestrated by a benevolent republic. Without the republic, Saw would have never gotten trained in the various weapons and tactics that he would use for the rest of his life. The Mujahideen received a great amount of support and weapons from the United States during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Then, when Saw Gerera and his men faced separatist attack helicopter droids, their Republic allies managed to get shoulder-fired anti-air missiles smuggled to them from a third-party organization. For those of you history buffs out there, you probably see where I'm going. The Mujahideen were backed secretly by the United States and CIA assets during their own war against the Soviet Union. At the time, the Soviet Union employed attack gunships that were decimating the local populace. The United States used third-party countries to smuggle shoulder-fired Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen to counter these helicopters, and that greatly turned the war in their favor. Saw Gerera and his partisans would turn against the Republic once it became the Empire, and various members of the Mujahideen fighters supported by American assets during the Cold War would turn against the United States in modern times. Perhaps Che Guevara is much more similar to Saw Gerera than I initially realized. I mean, Che Guevara's appeal as a political figure only depends on the fact that he does have an ideology. But ultimately, Che Guevara never really delivers on real positive political change. Like Saw Gerera, he was just a killer and a warrior hardened by combat, and so perhaps his ideology was just an excuse to be violent. A noble explanation for very noble deeds. So there you have it, guys. That is our breakdown of Saw Gerera and all the various influences, I think, behind that character. I think he's a very realistic and also like a warning sign for people out there that, like, you know, ultimately violence and violence alone will never solve any situation. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about my analysis and my connections between Saw Gerera and Che Guevara and the Mujahideen. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.